Oh hey, wanna know why I've been gone for so long? Yes! That's right, I've been grinding on Halo Infinite ever since I started talking about it, and I'm going to be joining a tournament called a Halo tournament that only exists for the sake of this episode. The name convinced me. Gaming competitions, generally called esports, are gaming events where competitive players challenge other players in a specific game. There are a ton of games that make their own gaming tournaments: Call of Duty, Counter-Strike, Valorant, Fortnite, Overwatch, Halo, Pokemon, the list goes on. But I'm waiting. But as you can tell, the first-person shooter genre, or FPS genre, is pretty common in esports tournaments. We got multiplayer online battle arena games, MOBA for short, which includes games like League of Legends and Dota, fighting games like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Smash Bros., and then some of the more complex genres like card games and even puzzle games like Tetris. Gaming competitions have always been a thing back then, but they were not as popular or talked about before. A simple gaming competition, in my opinion, is two people trying to one-up each other and try to get the highest score. Now, I was still in my pre-fetus era during this time, but I'm going to assume that some people, if not most people in the arcades, would usually do this. If I were a kid back then, I would show off and boast about my high score in Dig Dug. The earliest known video game competition took place on October 19, 1972 at Stanford University for the game Space War. The students were invited to an intergalactic Space War Olympics, whose grand prize was a year's subscription to Rolling Stone, a monthly magazine. Now, I wasn't born around this time, so I can't really judge its worth, but I'll just assume that this was a pretty big thing back then. The winners were Bruce Baumgart, who won the 5-man free-for-all tournament, and Tovar and Robert E. Maas, winning the team competition. Ever since then, companies like Sega have been holding their own gaming competitions, but everything changed with the release of Street Fighter II in 1991. Street Fighter II was a revolution. This game popularized the concept of direct tournament-level competition between two players. Before Street Fighter II, most video games rely on high scores to determine who is the best player, but this changed with the release of Street Fighter II, where players would instead challenge each other directly, face-to-face, to determine the best player. This gave way for the boom of competitive multiplayer found in modern action games. Moving back to 1990, Nintendo held the first ever Nintendo World Championships, which toured across the US and held its finals at Universal Studios Hollywood in California. Three 1990 World Champion titles were given. Jeff Hansen won in the under 11 category, Thor Ackland in the 12 to 17 category, and Robert Whiteman in the 18 plus category. There was no official competition round to warrant a single player. However, after the competition ended, there was an informal face-off between the three winners, with Thor Ackland taking first place, Jeff Hansen taking second, and Robert Whiteman finishing third. The winner in each age category was awarded a $10,000 US savings bond, a 1990 geometric convertible, a 40-inch rear projection TV, and the Golden Mario Trophy, but there was none more prolific than the Nintendo World Championship cartridges. There's no real evidence regarding how many of these were made, but the ones that are made are considered to be the most valuable NES cartridges of all time and one of the rarest. Now, what do these cartridges contain? 3 customized minigames based on Super Mario Bros., Rad Racer, and Tetris, and the only objective is to achieve a high score. That's it. There's really no reason to find and buy one of these cartridges other than for novelty purposes. You can get a much cheaper price with all of those 3 games separately than you would with a Nintendo World Championship cartridge. These cartridges don't contain the full games. Afterwards, Nintendo held another tournament in 1994 for the SNES called the Nintendo Power Fest 94. Like the previous Nintendo World Championship, Nintendo produced around 33 cartridges for the Power Fest, however only 2 exist. The rest were returned to Nintendo where they were reused for parts. When internet connection became more prevalent in video games, John Romero, who's known for designing early FPS games like Doom and Wolfenstein 3D, established competitive multiplayer in online games with Doom's Deathmatch mode in 1993. Since then, competitive gaming has become more popular than ever. The popularity of online streaming services has helped the growth of esports in the early 2010s. Back then, Twitch, which launched in 2011, frequently streamed popular esports competitions. In 2013, viewers of the platform watched 12 billion minutes of video on the service, with the two most popular Twitch broadcasters being League of Legends and Dota 2. The modern esports boom has also seen a rise in video game companies embracing the esports potential of their products. Now we have tournaments hosted by the big three: Nintendo, Xbox, and PlayStation. As a kid, I've always wanted to be in a tournament. I don't know why, I just wanted to sign up for one. Even though I've only been fighting against bots at Black Ops 2 because I wasn't allowed to play with anyone online at the time. But you can still tell how much I wanted to be in one. But now, no thanks, I just push mo. Ever since I became an official dweeb, I became less and less competitive in gaming. I don't play against pro players or play ultra competitive games because I just want to enjoy playing the game, which is what a game is all about. But some games are designed for competitive gaming in mind. Heck, even an entire video game genre is designed for it. Now, calling esports an actual sport is a controversial topic. You see, pretty much every sport requires physical activity and training. This requires you to sit, stare closely to your monitor, and press a bunch of buttons. We can go on and on and on about whether esports classifies as an actual sport, but here's my opinion. I view esports as an actual sport. Why? Well, let's take a look at one sport that doesn't require much physical activity, yet is still officially considered to be a real sport: chess. The International Olympic Committee considers chess to be a sport due to the fact that chess requires skill, and esport also requires skill. But you can disagree and state your own opinions. Do you really think my opinion matters when I said this? Lego Marvel Superheroes is the greatest game of all time. Now, I'm not a competitive gamer, therefore I don't generally watch esports tournaments. But that doesn't mean I devalue esports and do not care about it. I think esports introduces more people to the gaming community and gives many a different perspective towards gaming as a sport. Sure, gaming is a waste of time, and so is living. Esports has value. People play games with skill and knowledge, and they win prizes like actual money. Sometimes tournaments can show info about upcoming games or just updates to already released games. So these kinds of video game tournaments can also be considered to be video game conferences like E3. I wish there was one now. Now enough about those. What does an esports tournament look like? Well, there are flashy lights, a big audience, a roster of competitive teams, and maybe some merch here and there. What I like about esports tournaments is that they're always hyped up by the audience. You can see that everyone is engaged in what's happening on screen. Video game conferences, they're either boring as hell, have mixed reactions from the audience, or have an audience like that one guy from the Bethesda E3 2019 conference. Another thing that I like is the interactions between the two opposing players. They would roast each other for 10 minutes. Am I watching a rap battle right now? I'm not saying this happens constantly, but I like to imagine that it is. It's really awesome to see a rivalry spark between two players. It makes the tournament more fun and engaging. Now this is obviously a me thing, but I don't know a single person in any of these tournaments. I know some people here and there, but they're usually the more popular ones. I don't know anyone else in these tournaments. Not only do I not know the players, but I also don't know what this means. Yes, I don't know everyone and every team in any of these tournaments. You have every right to punch me, virtually. But there's one thing I know very vividly. One that haunts me to this day. MLG used to be the biggest meme on the internet for a time. Pretty much every video you see on YouTube during the early 2010s contains at least one bit of an MLG meme. All I knew about MLG back then was that it was just an organization for pro players, and that's true, but since this was pretty much used for trick shots back then, I just assumed this was something that's used for doing just that. Now MLG is still a thing today, though it died out in popularity due to the meme being overused around the early 2010s. So that's pretty much everything I knew about esports as a gaming competition. You can't deny the fact that it may or may not be a real sport, but you cannot deny that esports requires actual skill and knowledge of a certain game. I don't normally enjoy competitiveness in video games, but I can at least appreciate the value of one. Alright, the tournament's about to start. I've been training for this my entire life. Actually, I just started training over a month ago. Anyway, the tournament's about to start, and I am going to. I went to the wrong tournament. Oh, hey. I've been feeling a little bit philosophical today. That's why I'm scrolling through a bunch of Chrome tabs. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. Gaming has been somewhat stale lately, and I'm here to figure out why. Modern gaming is in a bit of an iffy state. 2023 has been an absolute blast of a year for gaming, which saw the release of numerous fantastic games. But with them, there are the scoundrels. The Lord of the Rings. Oh, wait, excuse me. The Lord of Ring Gollum, Redfall the day before. There have been a ton of mediocre crap that came out last year, and it's baffling since all of these games I mentioned came out around the same time. Games like Resi 4 Remake, Baldur's Gate 3, Spider-Man 2, and numerous other hits that made such wide appeals. Still, even with all of these great games, it's important to note that these games use a ton of resources. Spider-Man 2 can only be played on the PS5 and not on the PS4. A lot of these games, mainly AAA games, take up a lot of space and usually demand higher end systems during this generation of gaming. And you don't know whether the game is a hit or miss when you actually download and play it on your console by deleting all your other games, cause screw you, says Activision. Not only that, but games are plagued with microtransactions, and a portion of the game's content is locked behind a paywall. This doesn't apply to every game, but I am noting a few honorable mentions. Battle passes, loot crates, just to name a few. A game like Baldur's Gate 3 is truly a miracle to behold in an era of microtransactions in video games. But Baldur's Gate is a miracle, and it's not very often we get games where not only players can get the full experience without paying additional bucks, but also be able to deliver what the fans had wanted for a game that took a lot of time to come out. So what do we need to fill that void? Obviously, AAA game companies are overworking their employees to work on a title that's full of business crap, which is why we have the indie devs. Instead of the usual AAA big budget blockbusters like Call of Duty, indie games have become a new trend that threatens the industry in a good way. Indie games are a breath of fresh air from big budget games. Usually they take up a lot less space to download and you still get a ton of playtime with these guys. Indie games are created by independent developers or indie devs, often with limited resources and funding. These games usually are distributed to digital marketplaces like Steam and Epic Games, and you can browse a whole lot of them in these stores. But to truly know how indie games became so popular that they even have their own category in various gaming marketplaces, we need to learn how they came to be. There are still debates regarding the first ever indie game, but one of the first known examples of this is Space War, which was released in 1963. As the years pass, more and more people start making their own games as PCs become more accessible. However, at the time it was harder for them to sell their games. They would either have to publish their game by making their own publishing company or find someone willing to publish it, both of which are pretty difficult and expensive choices. Eventually, with the internet becoming more and more common, game engine developers started offering their software at low to no cost for indie devs. With Steam, Xbox, and PlayStation making game development easier, indie devs had a place to sell their games to everyone in the globe. Still, during this time, the video game industry was dominated by a handful of large companies. But since then, with the rise of digital media and accessible development tools, indie devs have been able to make and release their games without the need for a publisher. One of the most important impacts of indie games is that they have led to a more diverse and innovative landscape of video games. New ideas and gameplay mechanics are brought to the industry, pushing the boundaries of what is possible in games. Every time you play an indie game, there's always this one thing that this game has that makes it unique compared to other titles, and that's what I think the magic indie games have. Games like Paper Please and Return of the Obra Dinn have brought new gameplay mechanics and storytelling approaches to the industry. Just last year, I played Celeste, and my god, despite being a challenging game, it was a wonderful masterpiece, and it definitely had a lasting impact on me.
as it changed my perspective not only on video games, but on life.
See what I just did there earlier? I was being ironic.
Another thing about indie games is that they've given a platform to underrated developers in the industry. Even now, there's still a ton of great games that not a lot of people are playing because they're often overshadowed by big budget releases by AAA companies. Indie devs from diverse backgrounds and perspectives have been able to create games that speak to their experiences and culture. The end result of all this would make players feel more represented in ways that large video game companies have been struggling with their own titles. Indie game development has a ton of benefits. It allows devs to have creative control over their games. Since indie games are usually developed by a relatively small amount of people, it's easier for indie devs to maintain their vision and have the freedom to create the games they want to make. There's no boss or this one guy to announce strict requirements and deadlines when it comes to indie development. And I think that says a lot because you expect a video game company with a large amount of employees would be able to make and release games faster when they usually just keep adding irrelevant stuff like microtransactions and the like, and features that either do nothing or make the game worse. This may not be a real or accurate representation of AAA game companies, but that's just how I view it. You ruined everything for me. Indie games demand fewer resources and smaller budgets, which is why indie game development can be more financially rewarding for developers. Even if your game isn't a huge hit, you may still get a hefty amount of pay. But if your game does become a huge hit, you will be remembered for a long time. Indie game development can lead to greater recognition and success for low-level developers. Games like Minecraft have become a global phenomenon and made their developers household names. Successes like this are rare in the big budget gaming industry, where the company is fierce and marketing budgets are enormous. Which is why if you're an indie dev, always be creative. Do something that sets apart your work from others. Eventually, you'll be proud of what you've done. Even though indie game development has many benefits and has become a new trend in the industry, it doesn't mean it doesn't have any challenges. One of the biggest challenges is funding. While developing a small indie game development doesn't require a hefty amount of money and resources, it still demands resources, such as time, equipment, and software. Funding can be difficult as investors may be hesitant to invest in an unproven developer or game. However, platforms like Kickstarter and Patreon have made it easier for devs to crowdfund their projects and get the financial support they need to develop their games. But this doesn't always work or result in a success. Mighty Number 9, for example, while it had a successful Kickstarter campaign, the game faced criticism for delays and unmet expectations. The final product did not live up to the hype, leading to disappointment among those who supported the campaign, and it ended up being another Mega Man ripoff. To be fair, the trailer promised to make bad guys cry like an anime fan on prom night, so can you really blame them for not delivering a good game? Another challenge in indie games is visibility. With more accessible storefronts for video games and software development tools, it seems like so many games are being released every day. This can be challenging for indie games to stand out and get noticed by players. This is why indie devs often have to rely on social media, press coverage, and marketing to promote their games. Lastly, since indie games are often developed by a small team or even a single person, it means that developers have to be skilled in many areas, from programming to art design to marketing. Despite these challenges, the indie games industry continues to grow and thrive. They have become an essential part of the video game industry, bringing innovation and fresh new ideas to the medium. They have proven that big budgets and realistic graphics are not always required to create a successful and enjoyable game.
Ah! I've become so philosophical, I made an excuse to talk about indie games instead of the actual downfall of gaming. Well, I mentioned bits of it, but the point still stands. Oh hey, I like change, that's why I flipped the camera today. You see, I always wondered who I would be if this one thing about my life changed. Today, I'm going to figure that out. Well, that sucks. Imagine this. You play a video game for a long time, and you immediately recognize this one video game character. Now, take that character,
put that character as the main focus on a movie poster, and make the movie about a lame and original character that has nothing to do with the character you put as the movie's main focus. Why? Video game adaptations have now become a recent trend in the industry. Lately, video game adaptations like The Last of Us on HBO, the Super Mario Bros. Movie, and Five Nights at Freddy's have become major hits that, honestly, were really surprising, yet not at the same time. You see, video games are one of the greatest ways to tell the most innovative stories ever, with players being able to interact with them and even make their own stories. Ever since its conception, video games have been undermined for many reasons, mainly because how would a blue hedgehog make a deep and profound story? The thing with video games is that it is full of creativity, with them usually being cheaper than making a show or a movie. The stories of video games can be more accessible in a way that players themselves can interact with, increasing the immersion that movies and TV shows can't normally replicate. But these guys get a lot of flack because they are seen as violent or offensive in some ways, but why? They are technically more readily available, but in this age, they're about as accessible as pirating movies. Not only that, but there are also movies and shows that are also violent and offensive for some people. The same thing applies to any other forms of media, so why video games specifically? Well, kids love video games, and depending on what they play, they might harness the unwanted influence of more mature titles. But what I'm saying is that video games can tell great stories, just as movies and TV shows. So why do video game adaptations get a lot of flack? Well, let's take a look at some of the greatest video games ever with a profound story. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. One of my favorite games of all time, so I played this game way long after its release and just after this dumpster fire had ended. I still love the story, being set centuries before the events of the prequels and giving Star Wars a breath of fresh air of new locations and culture. Gameplay wise, not the best, but it's still fun. But RPGs like this title are prime candidates for being adapted to the big screen, and was the first ever video game to make a major adaptation on the big screen? Two Italian plumbers. So, Super Mario Bros. Not a bad choice, but an odd one at best. Remember, this is the early 90s, and Super Mario Bros. Was a pretty popular gaming franchise at the time. And the story in the Mario games is pretty straightforward. An Italian plumber rescues a princess from an angry turtle. Yeah, that makes a good story for a movie. Let's do that instead of adapting other titles like Final Fantasy that have an actual story that's well suited for the big screen. For those who are wondering why a Sonic movie didn't release at the same time as the 1993 Mario movie, recall this picture. Imagine this was in the 90s, and it might have been much worse. So let's start with one of the game So let's start with one of the biggest challenges of gaming adaptations. The first problem is finding a story suited for the big screen and trying to outdo the game it's adapting. That's actually two things. Some adaptations have failed due to there being little story to implement, and the result of forcing a popular title into a cinematic world is messy. Take a look back at the 90s. Stunts like these, where movie producers try to make the source material more appealing to the big screen, just somehow make it look worse. And that's one of the biggest challenges in adapting video games. Even if you pick the right game for the right story, there are still chances that producers might change bits and pieces of the source material to make it feel more appropriate for the big screen, and the result can either make the changes look better or make it worse. Adapting a video game into a movie or TV show is not an easy thing to do. In one way or another, games and movies share and borrow techniques from one another in delivering the core narrative and developing the characters, which leads us to the next hurdle for adaptations: having different audiences. Cinema is a spectator audience. People watch the movie, and they only get the information presented, the point of view that the people who made the movie want to show them. Video games, on the other hand, allow the audience to have more opportunities with how they want to immerse themselves in the story. You can interact with elements of the game world, and you aren't limited by a set amount of time. So you, as the player, are allowed to set the pace of the story in any way you see fit. Basically, Games can go heavier into the background story of the game world because they can just leave it there around the game for the player to find, whether it's required for the actual story or just some fun little tidbit the developers left to make the world feel more alive. And that can be done in a variety of ways like snippets and loading screens, landmarks, collectibles, notes, audio files, or even books and texts found within the game. As a result, games can trickle more information to the player without having to take them out of the game. Cinema can't do that. Extra story elements have to be shown to the audience, like a flashback or a lengthy explanation of sorts, and that runs the risk of taking the viewer away from the current events. What often happens here is that a lot of detail is lost, so there has to be either some information that the audience is expected to know already, or they need to change something so that the new medium can deal with it. Sure, they can give you a lore dump, but that isn't a great way to keep the audience invested. It's the same sort of deal when you also have another fair question. Why is it so hard to adapt a book to a film? Different mediums have different strengths. Some things have to be cut or changed for it to work when transitioning to a different medium, and there will always be some setbacks as a result. The next problem is Hollywood. Video game adaptations suck because they are made into cliche and generic blockbuster garbage. Hitman is a perfect example of this. One of the best parts of the games is trying to work out how to get from point A to point B, utilizing the environment and your tools to your advantage while sneaking and trying not to get caught. The movie only took the name and the signature look and then made a generic movie. In the film, none of the gameplay we see in the games is shown here. There's no planning because there is nothing to plan for. Sticking to the source material is somehow a challenging thing for adapting video games to cinema. How come we have multiple adaptations of Resident Evil, yet none of them are true to the bones adaptations? The series sure has some pretty cheesy moments, but the lore of the franchise is really interesting and would be suitable for live action. But they just couldn't do it! What's with it with creating original characters who have nothing to do with the actual source material and are just baked in there for the cinema audience and not the audience the source material is aimed for? But luckily, we still have some good adaptations out there. Let's start with my favorite of the bunch, Arcane. God, this show is a blast. The art style, the writing, the characters, the story, the music, and the world. Everything is literal perfection here. Arcane is based on League of Legends, which already has a large amount of characters and lore. The show just spans only a small portion of that entire world, and already it feels like the settings of the show are so big and diverse. That just goes to show you how great this show is. I think this is a great addition to the League world, as most people only play the games for the games themselves, and not a lot of people are really invested in the story of each and every one of the characters in the series, since the gameplay or the credibility of League is what sells the people's attention. We get to see more of the characters and how they interact with each other, and the whole premise of the show is that we are seeing the backgrounds of these characters before they became whatever they are in the games. Most people tend to overlook the rich lore of League, and it's baffling since the stories for every character here are diverse and interesting. Arcane backs that up, improves upon it, and we are left with an amazing video game adaptation. Castlevania is another excellent adaptation for a well-known video game franchise. The show is based on the NES game Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, a rather obscure title to adapt, especially for people who don't know Castlevania that well, including me, but I enjoyed the show. I like vampires, so I'm sold. Unlike Arcane, which emphasizes more on the stories for its characters, Castlevania adapts more stuff from the games, like the enemies for instance. There's a lot of variety when it comes to the creatures we see in the show, and it's not like we keep seeing the same battles happen over and over again. The story is great. Not as great as Arcane, but a great one nonetheless. I'm a huge Pokemon fan, so it's inevitable that I watch Detective Pikachu. It was alright. It's nice to see a Pokemon movie that's not about Ash or defeating all the Pokemon gyms, defeating the Elite Four and becoming Pokemon champion, What really disappoints me in this film though are the designs for some of the Pokemon. Pikachu, cute. Charizard, awesome. Snorlax, I, I don't know. It looks fine, I just never imagined him with fur. The story's fine too, it's just another generic Pokemon plot, but it's nice to see Pokemon in live action, and I think they did a decent job. The Sonic movies are decent too. Just some family fun stuff, and I like it. But my main problem with these films is it being live action. Something about seeing Sonic and a regular human being just kinda sets me off. It's the same sort of feeling I get whenever I watch the cutscenes from the 2006 game, which is why I believe the new Mario movie is better. After this abomination, it's finally time to see a Mario movie without it being in live action. And it suits well for Mario because most of the characters' designs wouldn't work out if they were done in live action. The story is good, Jack Black was awesome, and I really love all the references they put in the film. It is truly a gift to all Mario fans out there. Of course, we can't talk about all of these great adaptations without mentioning the bad ones. First of all, what the fuck? I've been a Monster Hunter fan ever since Monster Hunter World came out and played it a year after its release. By that time, I knew everything that there was about Monster Hunter. It was definitely a phase of mine since I never played anything that resembled like Monster Hunter World. It is definitely one of my favorite games of all time. But the movie, God. Alright, so the movie begins with a group of hunters, mainly the NPCs or characters we see in Monster Hunter World who are attacked by a Diablos. So far, so good. And then we cut right away to a bunch of military soldiers. I mean, there are guns in the game, but not M16s.
By the way, I'm going to spoil the entire plot of the film because it sucks.
So, how are these soldiers going to arrive in the world of Monster Hunter? Well, force them to go through a giant sandstorm. Then the chick from the Resident Evil movies teams up with the actual Monster Hunters and Ron Perlman to hunt a bunch of monsters in a pretty bland desert setting only for Gormagala, one of the most badass looking monsters in all of Monster Hunter, my personal favorite monster, to show up at the very end of the movie, and it cuts just right when their battle is about to start. What a great film, guys! You see, it did some things right. The weapons, the monsters, and the characters that were adapted from Monster Hunter World, but they had to go through all that effort to crap on the fan base and release a film that's just a walking pile of garbage. But beyond all this and my hatred for this goddamn movie, video game adaptations do leave a lasting impact on the gaming culture. Successful adaptations can bring new audiences to beloved game franchises and contribute to the mainstream recognition of gaming as an art form. But that's not how it may work all the time. Video game adaptations, be it successful or not, can have some interpretations or changes to the source material that may draw in audiences that value or like those changes in spite of the actual purpose or message the original source material is meant for. For example, in the Sonic movies, you might expect that you buy a Sonic game, play as Sonic, and run around every state of America in an instant. This is why, if you're gonna adapt a video game into a movie or series, just stay true to the source material. Otherwise, it might end up with a butt ton of controversies. That's the thing about making a good adaptation. It's about finding the balance between faithfulness to the source material and the creative freedom needed for a different medium. Successful adaptations understand the heart of the game and build upon it rather than reinvent the wheel. Sure, you can add some changes or your own additions in the adaptation process, but always make sure that the fan base finds it understandable and should not conflict with the original intention of the video game.
I finally got it. Change can either lead to good or bad things. So this time, I'm going to change myself by finding my glasses. Where the hell are they? Oh, hey, look at me. After more than 2 years of lurking in the basement talking about video games, I am now the marketing manager at Woodley Offices.
If you haven't heard about Woodley offices, they are the top 1 video game corporations you can find out there. They're so good, they just fired 1,000 people to make this commercial. So, why am I here exactly? Well, we have a brand new game to show this year. I'm going to be showcasing a brand new pre-alpha build of this new game, featuring in-game cutscenes and revolutionary gameplay. Be warned, the cutscenes and gameplay will blow you off. Holy shit, I'm a trailer now? There are 4 ways to market your video games. Show actual gameplay and in-game cutscenes, show only pre-rendered cutscenes or gameplay, show nothing, or tweet. Any video game developer needs to showcase their latest games. Everything but the good stuff goes unnoticed. And what better way to showcase your games than making commercials out of them? Everyone has something to show for themselves, and marketing is the best way to do just that. I've dabbled in the marketing pizzazz for 3 years now, and to sum it all up, depression. But video games are a different tale. You have to show not only the graphics and story, but also its gameplay and uniqueness. And being the black sheep among such a large and diverse crowd can be challenging, which is why creativity can make marketing campaigns so iconic and unique. That's right, using different colors and pixels. In the ye old days of gaming, most video games got attention through physical media. Flyers, magazines, publicity stunts, even trade show demos. Instead of only plastering the cover art for video games, screenshots of the actual gameplay of those games are also included. I didn't say they were pretty. You can just barely make out what's going on in these photos. But these were probably the only ways you can see what the actual game will look like, other than watching someone play the game. Around the time the Magnavox Odyssey released, which is the first video game console, it got its own commercial, and what did they include in it?
To create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey gives you all the exciting action of hockey and 11 other challenging play and learning games for the entire family.
Day-old water is a brand new kind of water. It looks, smells, and tastes like a day has passed. Not only that, but you can also get dead nutrients from this water. This commercial is everything but good. Sure, it showcases the console, but it sounded like the narrator was reading the instructions manual. And the music. When we hop on over to the 90s, video games started getting their own commercials. These commercials have a lot of charm, probably because they had actual production back then. They weren't afraid to show 16 bits of diarrhea. And you're telling me that these trailers are better than these commercials? They used a real gorilla in the Donkey Kong Country commercial. Step 1 in making good video game trailers. Fuck beta. But these commercials aren't the best. They can be pretty weird. It can range from simple but fun little commercials giving a wonderful glimpse at a certain video game to a female mortar shooting out a baby with a lifespan that's as long as my height. No wonder Xbox called this commercial Life is Short. Most of these commercials contain the same structure. A bunch of weird stuff happens to one or more people, either a character or element in the video game shows up, either that character or the narrator describes the game in a wacky way, then diarrhea. A lot of these commercials do the right job of immersing viewers in the products that they're selling. The more iconic commercials often transport you into the game's world, while Super Metroid turns dogs into wimps. Step 2 in making good video game trailers. Fuck beta. Throughout this time period all the way to the mid-2000s, a good portion of video game commercials often compared their games to one another, establishing competitions to find the best game out of the two. This also applies to video game consoles. The commercials would often tell you why you should buy this thing over the other. Same structure, a guy in a business suit starts talking with 2 or more TVs showcasing the different games/consoles in the background. Guy says the reason why one is better than the other, then diarrhea. But around the early 2000s, we finally got actual trailers for video games. With E3 on the rise, people have started taking video games seriously. Marketing is flooded all over the place, but more importantly, dedicated trailers and sneak peeks at video games and consoles. Presentations are handled more professionally while still launching hype across the audience. Back when we used to be creative instead of having dance numbers at every live show.
For the trailers, since games are becoming more and more advanced and that a lot of games are getting actual lore and story rather than just another simple puzzle platformer, usually trailers would often focus on the stories of the games rather than the gameplay. That's not to say the story is more important than the gameplay, but I find the story of a game hooks people better than the gameplay. I need a reason why I'm playing this guy in this setting. But reveal trailers can have a mix of both, show a little bit of story and gameplay for the people to fondle with. The story is important for trailers so that they are self-aware in delivering the tone and emotions, while the gameplay can be the icing on the top. This can be done the other way around, though it can be quite difficult to execute it perfectly. Plus, there are tons of other ways to execute a great video game trailer. Let's start off with gameplay trailers. As the name suggests, these are trailers that show the gameplay. Sounds simple. Now, what classifies as a good gameplay trailer? Well, first it must show actual in-game gameplay, whether that's recording the game through in-game features or simply hiding the UI. Second, it must not show pre-rendered gameplay. Pre-rendered gameplay or cutscenes are basically CGI, and while they can give people hints of what the actual game might look like, it's not a great practice to market your game. Third, the gameplay must not look like ass. If the gameplay looks bad to begin with, don't show it. Either wait for the game to finish development or mask it with some elements in the trailer so it doesn't look terrible. Masking it is also not a good practice, but if you're really desperate in marketing your game, be patient. Lastly, it must not be something Call of Duty considers a gameplay reveal trailer. Do not call it a gameplay trailer if the entirety of your trailer is a bunch of story. Otherwise, call it a story trailer. Try not to be misleading with your trailer titles. That's not to say the Black Ops 6 trailer is bad. I mean, it looks cool, but I could barely see what's going on with the gameplay. The perfect example of a good gameplay trailer is the reveal of Super Mario Odyssey. The stories in Mario games are fine, but they're not the main selling point of those games, which is why this trailer does so well. It encapsulates the best parts of the game, the simple but clean platforming, the different stages and level designs, and controlling various creatures using Cappy. This is a great gameplay trailer, unlike Starfield. Everyone still remembers this game, right? The gameplay in its trailers looks dull. It looks like your average first-person space shooter with nothing to note. Not only that, but the gameplay shown is nothing compared to the actual product. The game launched in a very catastrophic state, littered with bugs everywhere. The gameplay matters the most for every video game, it's the main principle, but there are times when the story matters more than the gameplay. Story trailers. Now, since these act more like standard movie trailers, the only job here is to give a glimpse of what events are going to occur in the game world. That's the goal. And there are tons of ways to execute the story. What matters is if the way it is presented matches the tone of the actual story. For example, Soulsborne games often have trailers that show very little about the story, condensing large amounts of information in complex riddles, and the same thing applies within the games themselves. You get bits of the story through NPC dialogue, again, most of which speaking in riddles and through item descriptions. The players are forced to web all of that information to make sense of the story, which reinforces the sense of mystery in these trailers. There's no right or wrong way to make a story trailer so long as you're actually showing the story and that the story doesn't suck. So, making pre-rendered cutscenes in this case is totally fine, but showing the actual in-game cutscenes can be a bit better. You can also add a little bit of gameplay to up the mood of the trailer. Cinematic trailers can be easily mistaken for story trailers, though they still contain most of the major elements of story trailers. Usually, cinematic trailers are pre-rendered and their focus is to emphasize the story of the game rather than the gameplay. It's in the name, it's made to feel like a movie that sets up the story or world of the game but doesn't show how the game plays. Next, we have announcement trailers. These aren't much to write home about. You can just plaster a still image, add some suspense music, and there you go. But that's the least you can do with these trailers. It usually includes a mix of cinematic sequences or simply brief shots of gameplay. It doesn't reveal much about the game, but it does warrant its development. There's so little that can go wrong with announcement trailers since you don't have much to present and that whatever you plastered onto the trailer can be easily fixed. Teaser trailers share some similarities, but they mostly differ based on the amount of information they reveal. Both announcement and teaser trailers present brief info, though announcement trailers are generally longer and give people an idea of what the game is going to be like by presenting some basic story elements or gameplay. Teaser trailers are more cryptic. They show much less information than announcement trailers, and it can intrigue the audience without giving much away. The goal is to leave viewers speculating about what the game could be. Basically, a teaser has less info, while an announcement trailer gives a more comprehensive look at the game. But games that are bound to release often upload launch trailers. These are released right before or on the game's release date to encourage folks to buy the game. Launch trailers are often a compilation of gameplay and in-game story scenes designed to showcase the game's best features. More importantly, there must be no pre-rendered cutscenes or gameplay in these trailers. The best thing to make people believe why they want to buy your game is if you show the actual game. The same can be said for DLC trailers or expansion trailers. These trailers usually highlight new features introduced in the expansion, showing how this new content enhances or extends the vanilla game. You can pre-render only if you're announcing the DLC, but once you're showing the contents of the DLC, it must be actual gameplay. But what makes a great video game trailer? The best video game trailers out there are those that not only captivate viewers, but also accurately represent the essence of the game. This can be done in numerous ways fitting. With the mass variety of types of trailers out there, it's best to maintain the soul of what makes your game beautiful, while carefully maintaining that through the type of trailer you're creating. The best trailers are those that not only promote the game, but also leave a lasting impression.
Wow, what would I give to play a game like that? Thanks for watching the reveal trailer. If you like it, consider leaving it a thumbs up. Better yet, subscribe to this channel while you're at it. If you do, you have a chance for a free giveaway right here at Woodley offices. What's the reward? A freshly laid corpse of a former employee who petitioned for a salary increase. Am I reading this right?